everybody. My name is Jenny Brinkley. I'm a director in security at AWS, and I am thrilled to be here today. Joining me are a couple of my colleagues from Amazon, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we think about privacy at Amazon. So, start with some introductions. I'm going to have you go first.
Hi, I'm Ann Toth. I'm director of Alexa Trust. I have been at Amazon for 1 year and 1 week. I think this is the most interaction I've actually had with my colleagues at Amazon in person, which is kind of ironic since we're doing this virtual event. So I started my career in privacy 23 years ago, kind of accidentally. I was hired at Yahoo as data miner number 2
Mm,
in June of 1998. And within 3 months, our general counsel had pulled me aside and he said, before you go doing anything with the data, your first job is to figure out what you're not allowed to do with the data. So
that sounds about right.
yeah. So I became Yahoo's very first chief privacy officer. And I'm not sure, but I think I was the very first full-time dedicated person working on privacy for any internet company back in 1998. And so what typically happens when you prove yourself to be pretty good at doing hard, ambiguous things, people give you more hard and ambiguous things to do as a reward. So I wound up doing a number of different policy areas throughout my career, including child safety, accessibility policy, content policy, advertising policy. But by and large, privacy and data governance are the things that I've done the most of throughout my career, all the way up to the present day.
That's awesome. I make jokes sometimes about Amazon that our love language is more responsibility. And that you joined us during a pandemic. I am a little curious, even though Ken, I'm going to get to you. So don't worry.
Okay, thanks.
But I'm kind of curious, and I'm going to throw this extra question out there. So you joined during a pandemic. You're meeting a lot of us for the first time.
Yep.
What is that like?
You know, it's on the one hand, it's very peculiar because I'm very interactive. I'm a very big extrovert.
Yeah.
So for me, operating remotely has been a big challenge. But everybody has been incredibly welcoming. I have to say that's been the thing that has been truly remarkable is just how well I've gotten to know people, even though we've been sort of
Yeah,
like through a screen all the time,
that's
right?
awesome.
Yeah. So I'm really relishing this interaction, and I'm really looking forward. I'm actually really looking forward to going back to the office someday. Someday.
Same. Same.
Yeah.
Well, we're thrilled you're here. So thanks again for taking the time out. Ken,
Yes.
I've worked with Ken a few times, so I know you well. But tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So I too, about 20, maybe 25 years ago, started to get on the internet bandwagon and joined a company that was trying to solve the secure messaging problem. Email was the killer app back in the day, and businesses wanted to send email securely. So we thought I had a solution. I worked on that for about 9 years, and I'm sad to say that I didn't solve it then. It's not clear that anybody has solved the secure email problem here 25 years later. It's a very hard problem to solve.
Yeah.
But got a lot of experience working with big enterprises and understanding what their concerns were with regards to data privacy and confidentiality. And moved through a couple different companies. Joined AWS about 9 years ago. Started the identity and access management team when it was about a tenth of the size it is now, maybe even 5%. And we kept having customers tell us that, hey, if we're going to move our sensitive workloads to the cloud, we have to have a way to make sure that we understand the security properties of that data. And we know encryption is a critical part of this, but encryption is hard. And back then, 10 years ago, encryption was expensive. So how do you make that simple for us? And so we started ideating on how we could make it easier for customers and let them choose to encrypt and do it in ways and not be afraid to make it happen and make it happen at scale. So that's what I've been doing, in charge of the key management service since it launched about 7 years ago, and getting a chance to talk to some of the most security sensitive organizations around the world and help them move to the public cloud.
That's awesome. I also have been able to spend some time with Ken when working with customers on trying to explain how our encryption process works, how do we try to make it easy, and that's so much about my job and what I get to do in security. So I get to focus on the future of where security and compliance is headed. I get to create different ways that we try to engage with our customers, make Ken and Ann, well, not make, they enjoy doing these things, but in terms of really thinking through how to make this complex topic easy and understandable, Also, how we think about empathy as it relates to security, because this can also be a topic that, frankly, a lot of us get a little nervous around. So, what we want to do with this fireside today is talk about how we think about security, or not security, I should say, but about privacy at Amazon. Also, give you some things to consider within your own business and within your own practice. So, you guys ready? Are you ready to see what questions I pulled for you?
Bring
Yeah,
it.
surprise.
All right. Let's start from the very top. Anne, let's start with you. Given that you might be employee number one in this space, talk a little bit about what you've seen over the past 20 years in
Yeah.
how privacy has changed.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing about privacy is your perspective on it is going to vary depending on where you are in the world. It's not the same globally. And I think that if we think about the changes that we've seen over the past 10 to 20 years, it's been more pronounced here in the United States. If you look at Europe, and when I started this back in the day, we were dealing with the EU Data Directive. Now we're dealing with GDPR. There are over 100 different national data privacy laws around the globe. But here in the United States, we've dealt with it very sectorally. And with the advent of GDPR a few years back, attitudes have changed, business practices have changed. It's been incremental here in the United States, but I would say that we've noticed it. I would not be having a conversation with most people about a law, a regulation called GDPR, as I have in the last few years. I would not have been having that conversation 20 years ago. People weren't talking about it. Customers weren't talking about it. Consumers weren't having a daily conversation about privacy choices the way they are today. In the United States, historically, it's been the Federal Trade Commission that has regulated privacy under consumer protection laws. And so it has been a patchwork quilt. We have laws in California now. We have local laws. I would say for the most part, if you're a business owner and you're trying to think about how to use data, not only do you have to think about all of the different types of data that you have, because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but you have to think about all the different jurisdictions you operate in. Do you create a one-size-fits-all approach to data? Do you try to do it that way, or do you approach it in a very in a patchwork quilt fashion? And I think that's the challenge. There's a lot of ambiguity because the goalposts are moving daily, actually, in many cases. So that's the challenge I think that we face. But I think actually directionally, though, we've been headed in a good direction for consumers. And I'm glad you didn't ask me about a crystal ball because I don't have one of those. But retrospectively, I've seen just really dramatic and interesting change over the course of my career.
But when you started at Yahoo and you get this job and it's brand new territory, which by the way, also too at Amazon, so much of what we do is uncharted waters and we get to invent and simplify and try different things all the time. How do you stay both optimistic when you hit these kind of roadblocks and challenges? Because I'm sure you've encountered people through the course of your career too that was like, privacy is not going to be a thing, Anne. That's great. So how did you get them to care? Like, how did you get them to understand, no, we need to be thinking about it. We need to really be considering how we document or just some of those knowledge sharing techniques?
Well, I think you touched on the word empathy earlier, and I think empathy is really an interesting and important concept here because words matter, right? And so even the word privacy puts you in a mindset of thinking about all of the things that you know about you that you don't want other people to know about you.
So true.
So one of the things I did very intentionally was rather than simply embrace the moniker of Chief Privacy Officer, I said, I'd rather be a Chief Trust Officer. I would rather focus on the positive of what we're trying to build. And I think that's the common theme that we all share here on this stage, is that it's not so much, we talk about protection, we talk about risk management, we talk about compliance, but what we're really talking about is building trust. And that is putting it into the positive, which I think is important, and it changes the conversation.
Yeah. All right, Ken, how about you? What do you think has really changed?
So I think that there's more complexity in the technology. I think if you look back at the types of initial internet technologies, database technologies, it was usually one company sort of creating this castle mentality of, I'm going to put all my most sensitive data in the center of the castle. I'm going to build a perimeter around that. And then I will be able to have some awareness of the data that's inside that system. And that's a classic security model that people have been using for decades. But now, because we've got so much diversification and specialization and cloud services that are able to really innovate on behalf of lots of different customers, you can't assume you always understand the location of the data. And security in the sense of confidentiality, integrity, availability is not enough. Because now if you're taking individuals' data, they need to be able to understand where is my data being used,
Yeah.
right? GDPR, I think, got something very right when they included that phrase, right to be forgotten. Right? And so if you are a service provider and you are taking dependencies on lots of other service providers to create a unified customer experience, you're still obligated to let your customers control their own data. So getting that control, being able to reason about it, I think has been a big change. And it's created a lot of complexity, which is hard for customers. And I think that there's also this switch from product to service, where I can look at a product and I can say, well, this company built this product. There's a lot of code. I can't change the code inside this, and so I can rely on these security properties. I can test them myself. I can bring the product in-house. I can bang on it, do whatever testing I want. Now with cloud services, we don't let you into our data centers. That's a good thing from a security standpoint. It's a hard thing from a trust standpoint. Because if I'm responsible for my customers' privacy and data, I want to know that you, my data custodian, are doing the right things with my data. And so there's now much more of an ecosystem around auditors who are given access to look at particular cloud providers. And then they have to convince the rest of the market, no, we've done enough diligence on this.
Yeah.
And so there's just a few more people involved. And from the end user who has their data and the service provider that's using it, we need to bridge that level of trust and make sure that people understand what security properties they can rely on with their data.
Well, and speaking of that, in terms of establishing the trust and a lot of the ambiguity around this space too, what advice would you have for customers? Like, what should they be considering when they're thinking about privacy within their business, and maybe they're early on and they're still trying to make these decisions? What would you recommend?
So in Steve's previous keynote, he talked about this idea of sort of assuming that you've got the most secure set of configurations in place. But I think before you do that, you definitely need to understand your data. We talk about data classification. So you can come up with as many different classifications as you want, but it forces you to get your hands and your head wrapped around where your data is located. Because if you're trying to convince your end customers that you are proper custodians of their data, you have to have done that work up front. So you might do that as a part of designing a new system. You might use some technologies. For example, our Macy service is a good way to help you classify large groups
Macy.
of data.
Sorry, I had to give a shout out.
So you may need to use a service to help you understand where your data is. But until you know that, it's very hard to figure out what security properties you want on different classes of data. Finally, you need to be able to trace where that data is headed. I think it's very easy, especially with lots and lots of web services, to say, well, I'm just going to take advantage of this service and I'll move my data over here to do something interesting. Oh, this is an interesting new machine learning service. I'll move this data over here. You are still responsible for being able to say, well, as it's been moving around, I know that data of this particular classification still has this base level of security property.
Yeah.
And I can convince my customers, my regulators, my auditors that I am taking care of this data, even though I'm delegating a lot of the handling of that data to some other service. And then finally, I think, as Steve mentioned, this culture of privacy, you need to make sure that security isn't just the oversight that comes in late in the game to tell you what you're doing wrong. At AWS, we have security people embedded in every team. And in the very first working backwards document, where we're talking about the idea and the customer experience, there's security practitioners in the room saying, okay, what do we want to be able to say about the security of that data, and how are we going to change the build process to make sure we deliver that? So that's something that I think all enterprises need to kind of not so much be afraid of security and some of the specific technologies like encryption, and work to embrace it and work and integrate it into all parts of your business process.
Well, and so much of what we always talk about too with security and related to privacy as well, that we always don't want to be this department of no and trying to be supportive and really understand where people are at. And what would you recommend for people that are just starting out and trying to understand what to make sense around privacy within their business?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of things there. I have part of my last remark about thinking about this in terms of the positive. It is there are multiple different ways to solve a problem, lots of different ways to solve a problem. Some of which are going to be more compatible with your privacy and security objectives. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily more costly or more time consuming. It just means that they're different, and you need to bring in the right people to have that conversation with you early
Who,
to be able to.
and not to interrupt, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious, like what would the people look like? What would that team look like?
Private people who work in the field of privacy, it used to be primarily lawyers. I don't actually have a legal background, although I don't know. People seem to think I'm a lawyer. I don't know if that's a compliment or not. I'm not sure, but I actually come at this. I
You come with
from
authority. I think that's what it
all
is.
right. I hope so. But I come at this from the standpoint of a data practitioner. And so I came into this job thinking about how do I maximize the value of data? How do I use data to benefit the customer? And as a relatively new Amazonian, I can say with 100% assurance that every single meeting I've been in, every single conversation starts with how is this good for the customer?
Yeah.
How are we working backwards from that customer's needs? And as someone who's worked in data science, that's my perspective with data. So I'm here not to say no, not to be a no layer, but to be a yes and here's how we're going to do it layer. And I found it to be, that kind of collaboration has been the hallmark, I think, of my career. It's really been working with people to solve problems in a creative way. And I think that's the thing that often we tend to think of compliance sort of in this very sort of audit compliance. We don't think of them as creative people. Absolutely, actually, there's a lot of creativity in trying to solve these problems and optimize for the best possible outcome with your data that keeps it protected, that keeps it secure, that meets your customer privacy promises.
That's so true. It's funny on the compliance side. I do a lot of work with that team internally at AWS. Some of the most creative people that I've been able to encounter and how they're tackling a changing landscape. It sometimes feels on a daily basis when we're looking at different activities that are happening globally in any event. So I'm going to switch a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about common misperceptions. And when I say that, I'm talking about misperceptions for customers to really kind of understand when they're thinking about just privacy within their business. I think, Anne, you touched a little bit about this too when you were talking about the being yes and privacy kind of puts people a little bit like on guard, maybe
Yeah.
a little bit, but maybe talk a little bit about some of those misperceptions.
I can tell you a story. I think there's just a lot of confusion about words and what they mean and how it plays out. When I first started at Slack, so I was early days at Slack, and we would demo this messaging product. We have this shared history in messaging. We would demo this messaging product and be like, it's amazing. We have the cloud. Everything's in the cloud. Everything syncs up. It's amazing. And they're like, this is a great product. We want Slack in a box. We want it on-prem. We want it here. And we're like, but the cloud. So it was interesting because, again, it was that wanting control about a lack of trust in things you can't see or feel or access. I want it here. And so there were, again, the creativity around the solutions around that were working with our partners at AWS to figure out a way to give those enterprises their own key management system so they could encrypt the data. They had access to it. We did not. To give them options as to where they wanted to store their data. Because again, I think there was a kind of confusion around how much security could be granted and under what circumstances. And those needs could be met, but perhaps not in the way they were actually asking for. And so that's where the creativity comes into play, is to solve those problems for them, to give them the things that they're asking for, but they don't know that that's what they're asking for.
I love that. And that's so, not to be like, it's so Amazonian, but it's so Amazonian. It's like how us to be able to look around corners and anticipate what's next and kind of live through cycles sometimes where we're completely misunderstood in situations. And that's actually one of the things I thrive about this place.
Yeah.
Ken, what about you? Misperceptions?
So I think for a long time, the best practice in security was keep your data over here and your secrets, like your encryption keys, over here, right? Like you can't mix the two.
Yeah.
I used to give a presentation where I would say, if you put your encryption keys next to your data, we call that encryption. because
Why
it
do I
will
feel
not
like there
work.
could be a T-shirt line with some of your sayings over
Yeah,
the years?
there probably could be.
Take note.
And so I can remember when about 5 years before I joined, and even up until about 4 or 5 years ago, all of the pundits were saying, take advantage of cloud storage. It's affordable. Take advantage of cloud compute. AI, ML coming along. Take advantage of that stuff. But make sure you keep all of your secrets out of the cloud because you want that separation and control. The problem is that if you want to be able to process your data quickly and get advantage of the scale and the low latency, like the laws of physics demand that those secrets be next to your data. And so now there's a real challenge for all CSPs to be able to say, no, you actually can have your cake and eat it too. And here's why it's safe, and here's why it's secure, and here's the assurances that you can get that these secrets are actually not available to us as cloud provider employees, and they're not going to be compromised by other folks. So I think it's the really hard technical story to tell.
Yeah.
But I think once customers have realized, oh, you know what, if I do have everything that is relatively close to each other, I can now get 10x the scale that I'm used to in an on-premise environment. And I can take advantage of cloud providers that are available in all parts of the globe. I don't have to replicate all of this proprietary secret and key management technology everywhere I want to have my workloads.
Yeah. I'm going to get to the exciting topic now. It's all about Anne. I know that this is a topic I get asked a lot by my friends, my family, about my Alexa devices. Talk to us a little bit about what your day-to-day looks like in terms of how Alexa is ensuring privacy, because this is such an important topic, and I think it's helpful for people to also understand your role and what you're doing in that work.
Yeah, well, I mean, I literally, like, I'm a wind-up doll. You just sort of pull my string, and I can talk about this all day long. But so you're actually looking at an Echo device that is Alexa enabled. Alexa is the voice service. The Echo device is the hardware. This is a service that is less than 7 years old. So Alexa was literally born in a privacy-aware world. And we were talking earlier about some of the things, with regulation, there are a number of things, the right to be forgotten, this ability to export data. 20 years ago, we were building tools to ingest data, and we weren't thinking about data export. We weren't thinking about all of these requirements. And now we have the beauty of actually building those things in and building privacy into our products at the very beginning of product conception. So you're looking at a device on a screen that has a blue light illuminated, and that was one of the very conscious design choices we made because there's a common misperception that these smart speakers and that Alexa is, quote, always listening. And that's not the case. We made some very, very specific design choices. The blue light comes on to let you know after you've used the wake word, Alexa, in many cases, that data is streaming to the cloud. It's a visual cue. We have auditory cues. On devices that have screens, we have a physical shutter that you can disable the camera. There are a lot of very specific choices that we've made because I recognize that it's not just about building trust with a customer for them to make that purchase decision. In many cases, they've already extended the benefit of the doubt to us. They've already said, I trust you. It's ours to lose. So everything we do ongoing is meant to deepen and strengthen that relationship of trust because it's an incredible privilege that people have put these devices in their living rooms, in their kitchens, in their bedrooms. So privacy was always, for us, it was foundational. It had to be because of the nature of the product that we were selling to customers. So that's been, for me, it's been a pleasure and a joy to join an organization, to join a product team that's been thinking about this from the very first inception of the product.
That's so cool, and it's so true. Ken, to you on encryption. So I get asked a lot when I meet with customers to kind of demystify when we say end-to-end encryption or encryption everywhere. What does that actually mean? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'll try. It's a thing that I could talk on for hours, so you may have to rein me in. But
It's true. I'm keeping time.
if you think of it from the perspective of a developer, there's sort of two things that all developers need to make encryption work. One is the software that's going to perform the encryption or decryption on the data. And then is a source of secrets, specifically keys. And the software, is very public. It's open source software that does encryption. Some of it has gotten a little bloated and complex to use over the years, but nonetheless, customers can use that. The hard part is the keys, because once I use a key, now I have to think about where am I going to protect that key. I've got the durability of that key is now at least as important as the durability of the data that you're protecting. And I can't store plain text keys next to the data, so where do I put it? And that's where key management systems or specialized hardware modules called a hardware security module, HSM, they've been around for almost 40 years to try and protect those keys in plain text and then make them available to applications as they need to use them. So in that model, what we do at AWS, we give developers choices, right? They can come into the cloud, run their applications in EC2, and use existing software, existing keys that they've been using on premises for years. Works great. If they want to try and simplify the software that needs to do the encryption, they can delegate to our storage services. So every AWS service that stores data classified as a storage service will do encryption. And it can be tick the box, it's just Automagic, or we let
Did you just say Automagic?
Automagic, yes.
Okay.
I did.
Another T-shirt for
That's
Ken. Automagic.
Or you can say, well, you know what? I don't think I want AWS to just do this transparently. I want to have some more control over the keys, right? So maybe I'm okay delegating the software side, but I care about the secrets. So within the area of secrets, we give you lots of choices. I can, for example, say, I want a dedicated hardware security module that's all mine, and I want a service to use that, okay? Or maybe I don't want to manage HSMs, but I still want my keys protected in the highest quality HSMs that have been validated by the US government using like the FIPS 140 standard. And so I'm going to let Amazon handle the physical security and confidentiality of keys, but I still want to control when those keys get used, right? And we think that that's really where encryption in the cloud is headed, is that customers need to be able to say, all right, this key can be used for this data, by these people under these conditions, right? It's the same access control that everybody has to do anyway for their resources in the cloud, but now you can apply that to the keys as well as the data. You get that belt and suspenders approach. And the fact that you...
suspenders approach.
That's right. And as Anne was mentioning with Slack, so about 5 years ago, I think it was about the time you were transitioning out of Slack, you had ideated on this idea, and Slack now says, hey, we can give our customers this awesome separation of control. We as Slack are sort of handling the data, but the customer gets to control the key inside the AWS Key Management Service. And so now Slack can't extract keys. AWS, who happens to have the key, can extract the data from Slack, and the customer gets control of both things. So it seems to be a sweet spot. We see a lot of other service providers that are doing the same model of saying, okay, we'll get logical separation here, but we don't have to force all of our customers to invest in expensive encryption solutions and train a whole team on how to manage it. All they have to do is think about, it's just yet another access control problem that I have to do anyway to use AWS.
You could talk about encryption all day.
I could, yeah.
Well, and I think, to our earlier point, I mean, you spend most of your time, Ken, talking with enterprise customers, and in most of my career, I've actually been talking to consumers, actual end users.
Right.
I think there's a lot of confusion about encryption, about the difference. I used to say, data is encrypted at rest, and it's encrypted in transit, and I would get people looking at me and say, oh, so it's end-to-end encrypted, and I would, no, it's actually, that's not always the case. They're different things, and they're different applications and different types of, they're different, just as there are different types of data, and there are different types of data governance programs you establish depending on, is it child data, is it financial data, is it health data? You have different types of handling requirements and different types of encryption that work well for different types of data. We're very focused on, within the Alexa org, on using data to improve Alexa, and it is absolutely the case that there's a direct connection to the data that we collect, the voice data we collect, and how we use that for model training, for machine learning, that has demonstrably improved. You can actually, like if you looked at just 1 year, 1 quarter of being in a new language.
Yeah.
And we see double-digit improvements in just how much better we get with accuracy
That's
in a very short window of
incredible.
time. Yeah, it
Huge.
is amazing, actually.
And I think also too, because I want to touch a little bit on transparency. I think getting that kind of information for people to understand in any kind of business practice where you do have this kind of data collection component and customers asking for more transparency, how do we talk about it? I mean, how do we get people to understand and get some better perspective?
Well, I think sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? Is how the expression goes. And transparency is one way to demystify
Yeah.
things. It has limits because, as we've discussed, technology is getting more and more sophisticated. So the idea of perfect algorithmic transparency, can we offer that? In some cases, probably not. But there's a lot that we can do to pull back the cover. And for us, that is giving customers access to all of your voice recordings, all of the transcripts. You can see what we know. You can see how we use it. And I think that is the first step to helping drive education and awareness is just pulling back that layer and saying, okay, here is what we have.
Yeah.
And that's step one. I think my observation is that people can be a little wary of the things they don't understand. And the gap between what we understand and how quickly technology is growing and evolving, the gap is getting bigger every day. So it is a growing challenge for technologists to help get consumers comfortable with the technology that we're building.
And do you think it's more about providing education? Is it more? Because I think also too, because I get asked a lot, in terms of being more transparent in terms of how AWS operates, because I sit inside the security organization, so I get asked a lot of those types of questions. I'm just wondering, like, what should we be providing?
Well, I think at a minimum, you should, to the extent that you're giving access to your data, you should see some tangible, demonstrable benefit from the fact that companies have your data. If you can't do that, you have to ask yourself, well, what are we doing here, right? And so I think that for us, that is the way you get people comfortable. And if you talk to customers, if you just have a conversation with people, they'll say, actually, if I understand why you need it and how it's being used to help me, I'm great with that. It's all of the other sort of components of the data ecosystem that I think they're a lot more opaque. And I think that's what I think drives the anxiety and the concern, and the lack of trust comes from a lack of that clarity.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Okay, Ken, I'm going to move forward. You excited for this one? Do we know if it's a sunrise or a sunset? What do you think?
I
What do
would
you
say
see?
it's a sunrise because it's always day one at Amazon.
So
She's
true.
good. She's learning.
Picking it up.
Only a
One
year
year
in.
One
a
year
year
and
and
a
a
week.
day, a week,
53 weeks.
53 weeks. So I want to talk a little bit about, especially what you've done over the past few years. And this is more about trying to create that culture of privacy. So when we think about that, and even what that means, like, okay, we're gonna have a culture of privacy. Like, what are the steps that people should consider? Like, what have you done to kind of
Right.
advance the cause?
Well, I think, as Ann mentioned, this opacity problem, it's sort of the secret sauce. You're delegating more work, undifferentiated heavy lifting, as we like to say, to an AWS service. But now I don't know how it works, so how can I trust it? And I think it's a
You
real
made
problem.
it too easy for them.
Well, in some ways, we may have. So we start with, and you heard Steve talk about API security, sort of an idea that we helped invent 15 years ago. This idea that we don't do anything in our services until we have proof of your intent, right? A digital signature, it's your unique cryptographic identity. You asked us to do a thing. That may have caused 3 or 4 or 5, 10 other things to happen after that, but it all starts with that. And we have to explain how that works, right? When it comes to cryptography, as I mentioned before, the algorithms are designed to be public. That's the culture across the cryptographic community. And so we are very transparent about the algorithms that we use, and we're transparent about how we are managing keys. When we launched the key management service, we said, we're going to explain everything about how we are building a massively scalable system that can do encryption, right? The industry products at the time, maybe they could do 5,000, 10,000 transactions per second. We do over 2 million transactions per second.
Insane.
Right? And so getting people to understand, well, how can you do that, but in a way that your own team members can't extract the keys? Like, how does that even work?
Yeah.
So you've got to explain how that happens. And then you have to be able to say, all right, this is the way we've designed it, right? Nobody can access the keys in KMS. Nobody can access your data running in Nitro. You take advantage of Nitro enclaves for further isolation or privacy. Your own employees can't access that. We can claim that, but we need to have some third-party evidence that it's
Right.
actually happening. And so that's why we lean in really heavily to compliance audits. We use things like the SOC 1 and SOC 2 because it's a chance for us to declare our own controls, right? In many ways, CSPs are out ahead of the regulators and the auditors because we're innovating quickly. We have to say, okay, here's a thing that we've done, and here's the security control you can count on having been in place over the past 6 months or a year, so that you can believe that when we tell you it works this way, it's actually been working this way,
Yeah.
right? So I think that ability to hold your feet to the fire and make sure that third parties are constantly coming in and proving. And it really, as I mentioned before, your own team members have to prove to each other that you're doing things in the right way. You know, AWS is fortunate enough to have over 1,000 employees that care deeply about security, and they all embed themselves in other teams. That's what builds that culture. You don't need 1,000 employees to do it. It
Yeah.
just starts with a few to make sure that, hey, let's start early. Let's make sure we understand our security story before we launch our new feature, our new application, our new business.
Well, and so much how we operate within security too, and to your point about being embedded in teams. I mean, we have programs internally called the Guardians. And these are actually security practitioners that we then train within a service team to understand how to think about security from the moment or even before a line of code is written. So it's so embedded into how we operate and how we work. You also touched on something when you were talking about our audit reports. There's another great site to check out. It's our AWS Artifact product. It's actually a listing of where you can go and do your own deep dive and analysis to really get some perspective and understanding about some of these different trust reports that are produced from third-party auditors for us to meet our compliance obligations. So it's a great resource. It's easy to navigate. But yeah, I do want to hear from you, Anne, about this because obviously it's so important in what you've been able to do over the course of your career and how you think about it.
Well, first and foremost, we use our own products, right? So every one of us in the Alexa org is using. I mean, I think I've lost count of the number of devices that I actually have in my home office. Actually, no, I have exactly 4 because I have to mute them all before I start a call at
Right.
work because otherwise Alexa would be
I
invoked
was
all
going to
over
say,
my.
every
Yeah.
other word is Alexa.
It
You're like,
truly
yes.
is. So I know for sure that the mute function works really well. But so we use our own products, and that results in some interesting product development. So for example, we have all these privacy controls. We have a privacy dashboard in the app, but there was a conversation that said, why can't I just tell Alexa? Why can't I just say, Alexa, delete what I just said? Alexa, delete everything I've ever said. Alexa, why did you do that? Actually, that's my favorite. If you do one thing and if you have an Alexa-enabled device, if Alexa doesn't do what you expect, ask. Alexa, why did you do that? And so we built these voice-forward features for a voice assistant, which seems like, oh, of course. But it's the using the product every day that makes you realize this is a differentiator. And more, I think what you're seeing is companies not just looking at privacy as a compliance function, but as a competitive differentiator for their
Absolutely.
products.
It's so true. So we're at the end. Close to, I know.
This is fun.
Actually, I miss people. Can we just like have a moment about being around people? I miss the energy of being able to not be through a screen.
Yeah.
But I'm
Right.
really just
This time
appreciative
next
too.
year.
Yeah,
This
this
time
time
next
next year.
More people.
Oof.
More people.
So I want to talk a little bit about takeaways. We sometimes when we're working on content in partnership with Steve Schmidt, we love top 5 lists. We love like those action items. So I want to talk a little bit about maybe the 2 or 3 things that a customer can take away from the conversation today. And maybe they're kind of early on in their journey, or you know what, maybe they have an established privacy program. But I'd just be kind of curious to get your thoughts. Ken, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, sure.
You're on.
All right. So it's glib to say, hard to execute, understanding your data. You can't apply the right security properties and ensure privacy and be able to convince your stakeholders unless you know what your data is all about. And I think because you can apply so much automation to this, whether you're using AWS services or any of our third parties, I think it's a little bit easier, even though the scale of the problem has gotten bigger. So you need to have people, your security practitioners, understand this, continue to do that. And then when you're using cloud service providers, the shared responsibility model, people conceptually understand sort of either end of the spectrum. It's that thing in the middle.
So yeah, explain a little bit about shared responsibility.
Yeah.
'Cause I think it would be helpful.
So if you think about the types of things that you would expect a computer system to be responsible for, so obviously your server lives in a building somewhere. It's got electricity. It's got power. You want somebody to make sure that unauthorized people aren't in there touching the server, messing with it. That's not your responsibility as an AWS customer. It's our responsibility, right? And so as you delegate more and more of the operations of a given compute environment to us, that ends up being sort of the security of the cloud. We're responsible for it, and it's on us to prove that we're doing it using best practices.
Got it.
But you still own your data. We can't see your data. You own policies and permissions, right? If we want Anne to be able to access something on her device or in her database, like we don't know who Anne is, you do. And so you need to define that. And so that's the security in the cloud. But being able to look at your workload and say, okay, this stuff we're delegating and we're relying on these audit reports to give us assurance that it's happening properly. But this stuff over here, we actually need to take notes.
Yeah.
Because you're going to combine those two in front of regulators, big customers, stakeholders to say, okay, here's how we're providing all the security and privacy that you need.
Thank you for explaining it. I get asked a lot, so
Sure.
I wanted to get your 2 cents.
And then finally, thinking about the life cycle of data. I think it's easy to say we're going to launch a big project. Okay, security's here. We've got the design. We did our pen testing, and it works great. And then 6 months, 12 months down the road, you're like, well, we just did 300 new pushes and deployments. Is everything still the same as it was? I wonder. Well, you've got to build in automated testing, automated remediation. So that lifecycle management, again, cloud services offer lots of tools to make that easy, but that's a cultural shift that I think customers really need to think about.
And everybody's going to be looking for you. So give us our takeaways.
All right. I think I think most importantly, privacy is not. People think of the compliance functions. They think of it as creating a limitation to what you can do with data, and I think instead it's an opportunity for invention. It's an opportunity to be innovative and to think about how you can create privacy experiences that are differentiating. So I look at it as a place where companies and organizations can actually raise the bar and create really amazing product experiences that have privacy baked into them, and in fact, where privacy becomes that facet which is the differentiator for you. I have never worked in a legal department or in a compliance organization. In organizations that I've worked for, I've either been part of product or, believe it or not, part of marketing, because privacy is a dimension of trust. It is a dimension of brand. It is what your product stands for. It is how you present it into the marketplace. That is a choice you get to make as an organization, as a product owner. That is not. Again, it's not about what you can't do. It's about what you choose to do with that. And so as a result of that, I think you can be really creative in thinking about the types of people that staff that function and how you organize it. It doesn't have to just be data scientists or privacy engineers or compliance. It's all of the above, because there is a lot of interesting creativity that comes into play. And we're seeing an explosion right now of interest in this area. It's only going to get more heated. So I'm just super excited to get to have been a part of it. And I learned so much today. Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Well,
Thank
and
you.
also just the fact that we get to work at the scale that we get to work on. And I'm not going to be like, yay, all the things, but like, I'm serious, all the things of how we think about privacy, how we're able to partner and work together, and just the job you have ahead of you in terms of providing that transparency, but then also, as we talk with customers as they're building out their own privacy programs, because I'm getting a lot more questions of should the team look? What should be the expectations that come out of it? How should they be partnering with the different lines of the business? Should it sit in legal? Like, there's just a lot of different perceptions about what that actually means and what it looks like. But that's it. That's all they let us have time for.
Oh,
All right.
I know.
next year.
Next year.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
thank you. Thanks for
This was
making the
great.
time. And thanks for everyone that's watching. Really appreciate it.